This episode of Warp 5 is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org. And if you want to join in on the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode or any other, please join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, that's B-A-B-E-L, into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
This is Phyllis Strong, writer-producer on Star Trek Enterprise, and you're listening to Warp 5 on Trek FM.
How we doing, Trip? Ready when you are. Prepare for warp.
Course laid in, sir. Request permission to get underway. Let's go.
Welcome, Boomers, to another episode of Warp 5. I'm your host, Brandon-Shea Mutala, and normally I would be introducing Patrick, but Patrick has locked his car keys in his car, and he's unable to join us today, so we are going to be doing it alone, but I'm thrilled to have on, for one of our last retrospective episodes, the wonderful, the knowledgeable John Tenuto. How are you doing, my friend?
Oh, very good. Thanks for asking me.
I'm thrilled to have you on. I have been wanting to have you on for this discussion for a really long time because you are such a big fan of Star Trek II, and I couldn't... We had a different guest on for the Augment arc, but I wanted to bring you on for this here. So for our Season 4 retrospective, what we're going to be talking about today is Affliction and Divergence and Bound. And it's going to be really fun because these do tie into TOS, and John is a humongous TOS fan. And with the tie-in to the con augments, we're going to jump into Affliction and Divergence. Now, John, I don't know if you've heard me say it before, but I've said it on this episode, on this podcast a few times. I am not a fan of this two-part episode because I am frustrated that they decided that they had to come up with this story to explain why the Klingons didn't have four head ridges in TOS. And as a fan, I'm frustrated because we didn't need that. It's silly. It's ridiculous. The obvious reason is due to budgetary restrictions and what they could do in the 60s. And that's all the explanation I need. What do you think of this? Let's just start right there with the big eyesore for me.
Well, you know, Manny Cotto thinks that, at least if I recall correctly, he believes that Divergence may be like one of their best episodes they did on Enterprise. But I think that may have had more to do with sort of the action, the incredible action in there, and the direction and all that. The great writing. But yeah, I could definitely see your point. There's a lot of things that if we explained, we would need to explain, right? In all of Star Trek, there's a lot of inconsistency, even internally within a show, right? There's money and then there isn't money, right? There's mentions of, the names of Starfleet sort of changes at the beginning of the show, and we don't spend a lot of time, narrative time, looking at that kind of thing. I think as a overall for season 4, a lot of what season 4 was trying to do was really showing what a prequel could be. And maybe sort of showing where Enterprise might have started at the very beginning, and that what it could have been from the start. And I think that if we sort of take your point of view, maybe they went too far in trying to sort of tie back to everything, or to tie back to the original Star Trek, consistently, and that may have affected storytelling. On the other hand, you could say, well, that's a big mystery, right? That to some fans, why? And then, unfortunately, you do have them in Deep Space Nine, kind of laying that on the table, right, where they sort of say, how is that a Klingon, and we don't talk about it. And by putting that on the table in a canon way, right, that sort of, so it does, there is a difference, right? It isn't just a makeup difference. It is. You're totally right. Exactly right. The only reason they look different is because they had the money to do it. And that's what Gene Roddenberry said he would have liked to have done originally, that's what he would have had the Klingons look like if they had had the money back in the 1960s to do that.
Now, how much do you believe that actual story, though? Like, how much do you believe that he actually wanted forehead ridges originally?
Well, I don't know if he wanted exactly that design, but I'm sure, when you take a look at the aliens on the original show and some of the really imaginative stuff they were able to do, whether it's rock creatures or they did sort of try to not be only foreheads, right, or just makeup. There was an attempt to have like an obsession to have aliens that were amorphous, and so. He may not have had that exact design in mind, but I'm sure he would have loved to have had the budget and or the technology at the time to do much more extensive makeup than just kind of like a goatee and a little bit of face paint. Mm-hmm. But yeah, whether he knew exactly the design or not, I don't. I think a lot of that's sort of Fred Phillips coming up with that idea for how to make that work. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so this is what the episode's known for. This is the one that explains the Klingons, and it's one that many fans were waiting for what, I guess 40 years at the time, 35 years, whatever it would have been, somewhere in there. And I do like the episodes. I think that they are a lot of fun. I kind of wish they weren't there. We recently had an episode where we did the essential episodes of Enterprise, and I made the argument that these two episodes are not essential because I simply didn't want to have that explanation in there. And if you look at it, you can kind of fudge around it by having, because at the start of Bound, Trip is there, and at the end of the last trilogy there, Trip is there, so maybe he just hasn't left the ship in the meantime and just decides to stay. So that's how I made it work in my headcanon, but I'm sure I made some fans unhappy.
Yeah, that makes sense.
This is a pretty exciting episode, as you mentioned, though. There's a lot of action that's going on here. And, we've got this great shot in the second part where the two Annex-class ships are, like, upside down against each other here. And it almost feels like, as well, the whole Trip leaving plot line was set up just for that one shot. That one really epic shot of the two ships upside down against each other. What do you think about that?
Well, it's funny, when that aired, what are we talking about now? We're talking 15 years ago. When that episode aired, I was teaching, and I was teaching a Star Trek themed class at the college. It was a sociology class, and some of the students liked Star Trek and knew nothing about sociology, and others knew a lot about sociology and nothing about Star Trek. And it was a really interesting class, and Enterprise was on, so part of their weekly homework was to watch Enterprise, and then we would talk about any social issues that were in the show. So I always vividly remember this, a student coming up after Divergence had aired, and a pretty reserved kid. He was, kind of like a shy, introverted kind of kid, but he came up and he said to me, that first 11 minutes was the most exciting 11 minutes I've ever seen in television. Mm-hmm. And I remember, now you look at it and, okay, they can do so much more with the CGI and all that kind of stuff. But I do remember watching that opening sequence and thinking everything from the music to the camera work by Marvin Rush to the editing to the acting, that really is, I think, some of Star Trek's most exciting moments is that transfer sequence and how they set that up, and the ingenuity of it, the cleverness of it, and just, Judy and Gar Reeves Stevens coming up with that is just, not surprising because they're really great. I mean, it was a very smart move to bring in quality book writers, to do some of the scripts. And,
stay tuned, listeners, because we got a Judith and Garfield Reeves Stevens interview coming on episode 200, and that's a promise because it's already recorded.
Oh, that's awesome! Yeah, I mean, they were so and they're so great. I mean, I so I just thought that is one of my favorite sequences ever in Star Trek. I can watch that again and again and again. I love that transfer. I love the way the camera moves. There's so many great shots in there when you have the Columbia and the camera pans across the bow of the Columbia right directly into the ship, right onto Captain Hernandez, and you've got, of course, the sort of spin around with Trip with the camera angle, and the fact that they did that when they were given literally no budget, because you can see that in the fourth season, the budgetary limitations, that they were under, because they kind of knew that was their last year. And it was more sort of like, let's get to syndication numbers, but there were budget problems. But they did so great in that episode. I love that scene.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really outstanding. I agree with you. It's one of the most intense action sequences for TV of the time. That first, as you say, 11, I haven't timed it out, but yeah, that first 11 minutes there is pretty off the wall, for edge of your seat filmmaking, and I think it still is. But we got some really cool things that are established in this. Well, we had her established in Home. It's really great to see Captain Hernandez in a command position right now, because while we had Janeway once before as a woman captain on the show, this is pre-Kirk era, right? This is early, saying that the second ship that we're going to launch we've got a woman running it, and not only that, but then she's Hispanic as well, which is really cool. This is a character that I really wish we would have had more of, and I think it's a very important character in Star Trek history, and is often overlooked because Enterprise is often overlooked, but I think she's also overlooked because she's only in 3 episodes of the show.
Yeah, she is a great character. In fact, when I was revisiting the episodes the past couple weeks, just watching them a couple of times, it struck me how, as much as I want a Pike and a Spock and a Una show, I would have loved a Captain Hernandez show. I thought she was a great captain. I loved that there was sort of a twin ship to Enterprise out there. It would have been, I think, really remarkable had they sort of had. And in fact, I know that I remember when Discovery was announced, and there were sort of guesses as to what it was going to be about, and we didn't know anything. It was just at the very, very, basically the name was announced, but that it was going to be somehow different. I remember one of the ideas that was bandied around was that it would be a multiple ship show, so that it wouldn't be a single ship. It would be the stories would take place on several different ships, and I thought that would have always been a cool idea for sort of a 5th season of Enterprise, would have been to sort of have a 2-ship show, and bring on and cross-pollinate the characters a little bit, maybe make Trip over there a little bit on the Columbia. And I always thought that was great. She was a wonderful character. She was, like you said, in many ways historic. It sort of finally answers that question that, has been lingered, with critics of how progressive was the original Star Trek. I always thought that in the last episode, Turnabout Intruder, when Lester is saying that there are no women captains, that she was just mistaken, that she wasn't a captain material. And that she wasn't necessarily to be trusted because of her mental state. And this shows that there are obviously female captains in Starfleet. Pre the motion picture era, when we see the female captains in like Star Trek 4, and we see several female captains. But I think that's an important for the show to have had that also.
Mm-hmm. See, with that line from Janice Lester, like I've always interpreted as, I believe the line is, your world of starship captains doesn't allow women. And,
right.
The way that I've always interpreted that is like they had a relationship in the past. It's like Kirk chose to not be married. Picard chose to not be married. That's my interpretation, is that being a starship captain, you're sacrificing that family life. And it doesn't mean that women can't be captains.
Right, because we've never seen that. I mean, we see it in the books, right? But in terms of the TV shows, right? You know, Kirk didn't have a stable family life, and neither did Picard, and neither did only Sisko, right? I mean, Sisko kind of broke that mold. Janeway didn't. Archer didn't. Right? So only Sisko, and that's one of the reasons that he's such a great character and historic too.
And he wasn't a captain at the time.
And he was not a captain at the time. That's right. That's right.
Mm-hmm. We actually just did an episode of our new podcast, The Line, which is a Star Trek Picard podcast here on the network, and I did a whole episode that was actually released today as of our recording here on August 12th, convincing my co-hosts that Captain Picard actually is a family man, and he developed over the 7 years in Star Trek Generations. His Nexus sequence is perfect for him as a character. So go listen to that if that got you agitated, because you remember Picard saying he doesn't like kids in Encounter at Farpoint.
That's of course, and we're interested to see where he's at and what he's at and how much of the books and such they bring in with Picard when it becomes a TV show.
Mm-hmm. So we've got this idea, which I think is very, very true to who the Klingons are in this two-part episode, with them finding out about the augments and wanting to stay a military power by stealing this technology, stealing this data, stealing this research, and creating their own Klingon augments. I think this is very true for who the Klingons are, and I do think it is a fun story, and I do like it a lot. So what do you think about the augments and bringing back this Khan element that had been established earlier in the season?
Well, yeah, I mean, any even slight tangential connection to Khan, I'm going to like it. It's hard not to like. But, yeah, I mean, I thought, I mean, what's remarkable and just shows you what a talented actor James Avery is, right? So James Avery, who plays the General Kavash, or Kavah, he's
Uncle Phil.
He's Uncle Phil, right, from Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. And he's so good in that role and so great as a Klingon. And he makes that really believable, realistic, argument that the human beings, augmented human beings, which they believe is possible, right? I mean, the Phlox kind of argues, no, humans. That was a renegade situation, right? That the humans know better than to have augments, but from their perspective, it's the same sort of perspective you get in Star Trek 3, right? Where it's like, well, yeah, the Earth is making the Starfleet is making this for terraforming purposes, right? It's a weapon, right? So it's being filtered through the Klingon lens of the potential danger to them. And when the general just kills the prisoner who is in stage 1 of the disease and has several more stages to go through. Well, meanwhile, they're trying to find a cure, and possibly the guy can be saved, and he just kills him because it's expedient for the research. That, I think, that really shows you kind of the difference between the Klingons and what was shown in Next Gen with Worf when he would not donate his blood. I mean, there's a certain expediency or efficiency to the way that their society is that does make them different. And I thought that was a great moment in the Enterprise episode.
Right. One of the things I've also said on this podcast is by the time Enterprise has come around, I'm tired of the Klingons. Like, with Sleeping Dogs in Season 1 and having Duras again in Season 2, I'm tired. I think they're stale. The Federation is always besting them every corner. They're always pounding their chest and screaming about honor. But to me, this two-part episode is really the best representation that we've seen of the Klingons in a long time. We've got 3 really great actors leading the way as Klingons, and I don't know all of their names, but we do have the guy from Star Trek 4.
John Shuck, yeah.
John Shuck, yeah, and he does a great job as Antos. And then the other Klingon who's in charge of the ship, when he's talking with Harris on the comm channel, I like his tone and I like his attitude, and I think he really does a great job of being a Klingon on screen. And same with, you said his name's James Avery, right? James Avery does a great job as well. Like, these guys really do a good job, and I think these Klingons really hit it out of the park like Enterprise has not done in 3.5 years.
They did and they also showed you the multifaceted elements of the culture, and then not everyone is a warrior, even within a warrior society. And it's funny because, of course, John Chuck had played a diplomat of sorts in Star Trek 4 and 6 as a Klingon ambassador. So he has this tendency of sort of playing these non-traditional kind of Klingon roles, right? And he did a good job in this, showing you what would a Klingon doctor be like. A person who's a healer in a society where they leave you, would they heal you, right? I mean, if you're on the battlefield, are you going to get healed? And so he does a very good job of sort of playing what does compassion mean in that kind of a warrior society. I thought he did a great job.
Because we'd seen a little bit of this exploration in season 2 with the episode Judgment, right? Because Archer had a lawyer, right? And I believe it's in that episode where they ask, like, well, you didn't think we were all warriors, did you? And honestly, yes, the answer to that is yes, we actually did think that, because that's really all we'd seen on screen before. So,
yeah, I always liked DS9, which is interesting because you would think they would have really explored the Klingon culture more fully, did tend to focus mostly on because of the necessity of the story, on the more militaristic aspects of it. But even DS9 will once in a while lay a little thing on there, like the Klingon restaurant owner, who sang and did his, that there has to be, Klingon janitors, right? And so, I mean, it's almost like within the military, the real military of our world in the United States military, every person in the military, no matter their function, has to also be capable of fighting. So even if your job is that you're in the band, you still have actual military training, even though you may not necessarily use a weapon in your normal course of your service. And I've always sort of thought, well, that sort of applies to the Klingons, right? So every Klingon is a warrior, or aspires to be a warrior, but at the same time they still need dentists and tax accountants and things like that. And then but they are capable of being that, or they approach their work with that same sort of mentality or idea. So I think this episode kind of highlights that, where you get these differing perspectives, from the prism of compassion all the way to the prism of death of whole colonies for expediency's sake.
And one of the things, like, we even have in our own society, while the Klingon warrior caste is really dominant and they feel like they're the most important, at least that's the impression that I get, they feel like they're the most important part of the Klingon Empire. I mean, even I would say in our military services, we have this competing, we're kind of better than you, right? Because, at least you see it in the movies where the Marines versus the commandos are like, oh, no, we're the real backbone and we're the more important ones. And the other guys are saying, no, we are. So, everybody kind of feels like they're the most important ones because of their job that they do, because they all feel that their job is very important.
And you see that theme carried through a little bit with season 3 of Enterprise, where you have the Mako versus Starfleet, but both because the mission is different, right? Where Starfleet is not a military organization, and the Makos are, and but also just the different approaches to how you would the negotiator versus the action-oriented problem solver. How do you approach the resolution of a conflict? There's a couple things I was thinking about in the episode, just as an overall kind of thing. One, of course, you get Seth MacFarlane, which is great as Rivers. That's the sort of the Orville. Is that really Rivers, or is that
Does this take place in the Orville?
Yeah, it's the Orville. He crossed over. But what I liked about what I really liked about the fourth season of Enterprise, although I'm a big Enterprise fan, I think it doesn't get the kind of attention that it deserves. But what I thought about the storytelling mechanism Manny Coto brought in the fourth season were these sort of mini arcs, but that those mini arcs also linked to other arcs, so that nothing was, that and in fact I think that's the best type of storytelling for Star Trek, so that there is consequence, but I think there are problems within larger arc. A season-long arc is a problem on a show that's about discovering things, because then you can only discover a limited amount of things. So I thought that they kind of hit the right balance, and DS9 had done something kind of similar, although within, I think, a different kind of structural format. But I liked, like they would introduce characters, or you would have characters like Kelby here, and then Kelby plays a more important role in Bound, and but the setup is done here, so that it gave a coherency to it that I thought was you don't get in an episodic kind of usually don't get. Well, they'd hint at that occasionally. TNG, you'd get like, the episodes where Sayla you wouldn't see her face, and they were hinting that something was coming, that kind of stuff. But they really, I thought effectively did that on Enterprise, and I thought like having like a little bit of that conflict between Trip and Kelby in this episode, I thought was very good, and then there were a lot of callbacks. One of the things I loved about Manny Coto's season is there's lots of little callbacks. So when you have T'Pol mind melding with Hoshi to try to kind of help her remember, that was sort of a gentle version of what we saw in The Undiscovered Country, where you have the violent version of that, where Spock really violates in order to save the galaxy, Valeris, her mind and what she knows. And, obviously lots of references to Soong in this episode, and, you get the kind of the first mention of the Gorn historically, right? That would be the first time that they would have heard about the Gorn, and Section 31. I mean, they just did a lot of that. The one thing I would say that struck me about this episode was that if anybody's a fan of the original DC comic line, the Star Trek line of the 1980s that started in between Star Trek Star Trek 2 and Star Trek 3, and then carried on for about 56 issues before they came out with a second wave, which carried through for another 50 plus issues. But they had a storyline in there that was very similar, at least in terms of the resolution. So in that story, there's an ensign in the comic book. Kirk is kind of, as usual, sort of flippant self, violating the rules here and there within the comic book. And there's an ensign who decides to there's a culture that they meet where there's a disease among a unwanted part of the population. They were doing a allegory to AIDS, the early days of AIDS, and they have the ruling classes have no interest in trying to help the people that have the disease, because it's kind of clustered within this unwanted masses. And so the ensign gives the leader of the world the disease to force him to come up with investing in a cure. And that very much is what Phlox does at the end of this episode. And I always thought like there was maybe there was just sort of coincidence, but I always kind of like that connection between that comic book and this episode.
Well, I wouldn't put past them, because I mean they were doing a lot of callbacks to TAS episodes and stuff at this time, so I wouldn't put it past them that they would have done a callback like that to another version of the franchise.
Yeah, it was a nice. I mean, I liked that solution. And in the comic, they really dealt with then Kirk realizing like what kind of example am I setting for, because the movies are kind of the movies had Kirk move into this sort of like he I'm breaking the rules kind of like personality, and they all get in on it. I mean, Star Trek VI, they're breaking rules left and right, and in the show he was reticent to do that. Not that he wouldn't be innovative, but he wasn't as much of a rule breaker in the show, and I thought that was interesting. The comic kind of dealt with that aspect of Kirk, and I like that Phlox, who is very much kind of a rule-oriented person to some degree, and he kind of argues for a prime directive and medical ethics and being bound by procedure, and he's the one who kind of comes up with a almost Klingon-like solution. So his time with Antok affected him.
You had also mentioned the mind meld. I didn't want to forget about that because I wanted to call back to it. I think it was really interesting how it was done. Mm-hmm. The way that they portrayed it on screen with T'Pol walking beside her, but Phlox doing his lines from previous, but the two of them interacting around him. It was a really interesting take on a mind meld because we haven't seen mind melds a lot. And the mind melds we have seen have been like flashes of images and stuff like that. And we haven't really seen like a protracted instance like this of a mind meld before.
Yeah, it was. I mean, if you look at sort of Star Trek VI is probably our most vivid example of what a mind meld might look like, and that was more the special edition type of editions where they do a flashback and you see the faces of the people. I don't think that was in the original edition, and so so they this really was the first time you kind of got. I didn't think of that. You're very much right. That is the very first time we're really getting inside a mind meld for a protracted period of time.
And T'Pol gets a physical reaction when Hoshi's struck.
Yes, and they have the coloring, right, is different, right? It's sort of it's the same set and everything, but where it's very sort of dark in the original, it's more dreamlike, And then you see her and Trip too together, sort of in their FaceTime or whatever they were doing with one another. There,
Expected Q to show up.
Yeah, and do like a little, hey, Picard, you're dead.
I guess, but also before we move on to Bound, though, we should probably talk about Section 31. I can't believe I almost forgot about that. So timeline-wise, this is the first we see Section 31, and I'm one of those people, I kind of complained a bit about how Section 31 was portrayed on Discovery, where they're just kind of out there and talking about it, but we get that here. Harris is calling everybody. He's like, he doesn't call themselves Section 31, he's like, go to the charter, Section 31, but he's calling Archer, and he's talking to him, and he's on the phone, and he's, with Archer, telling him about these things and how Reed was doing work for him and whatnot, and how he's doing this kind of covert operations. So while it's not quite as in your face as we get with Discovery, it's definitely a little bit different than what we saw in Deep Space Nine.
Yeah, and I kind of read Section 31, at least post the DS9, because the DS9, of course, is its real origins and everything. But as they've sort of brought Section 31 into the Star Trek world more, I've always sort of read it as, maybe there's a Section 31 that's the public face of Section 31, and then there's more like the Sloan sort of side of Section 31. Obviously, supposedly we're going to learn why Section 31 kind of becomes more underground as a result of maybe what has occurred and what will occur on either the show or in the future episodes of the Discovery era. But I did like this. I did like this. Added a lot to Malcolm, and of course, this is what I mean about those little mini arcs that tie together. So they bring back Section 31 in the Terra Prime kind of couplet of episodes, which is beautiful and sad episodes near the very end of the show, and they bring sort of back Malcolm's connection to Section 31, and I thought that was a nice addition. I thought Dominic Keating did his I mean, he'd never been a bad actor on that show. And in fact, he was great in Shuttlepod 1. But I thought his interactions with and his struggle that he had within this episode, and particularly his scenes with Scott Bakula, were phenomenal. And they were really, you see in him the struggle. I mean, he is, when Archer says, your word doesn't mean much, right now, you feel the weight go out of the person, because to him, that's everything, that honor, that duty. And I just thought that was a great addition to the character. It would have been interesting to see them sort of play with that more had the show gone on.
Do you think that it's in character, though, for Malcolm to have been a Section 31 agent? Because to me, while he did a great job, Dominic Keating did a great job acting this, Reed is a kind of guy who's like very loyal, very by the book, right? He's a rule follower, not a rule breaker. So for him to be going and working for this covert operation, even at a young age, while I understand young people can make questionable decisions sometimes, does that, with all his history of his family being in the Army and the Navy and in positions like that, does that seem within his character to you?
Well, I think it's okay that they complicated these characters a little bit, but I see. I've never read. I mean, I think. I mean, okay, so I have a nickname for Admiral Cornwell, which is Admiral Genocide. And I really thought that they should have, that at the end of the first season, she should have been court-martialed. Okay. Because her actions were beyond, they were genocidal. I mean, that was beyond warfare. And they washed that just right away, and I'm glad, because she was great in the second season, right? So it was, and she's a wonderful actress, but I thought that was just, just beyond, and so that she's associated with Section 31, it turns out, makes a certain amount of sense, I suppose. But, I've always read Section 31 as almost like there's a dichotomy there, right? I mean, they are sanctioned, right? So Starfleet knows they exist. They're sanctioned. They operate in shadows. I mean, they're basically like a CIA type of organization. And so here's the CIA, and we look up. We as CIA agents are heroic and sacrificing and patriotic and all of that. And then there's elements of what they have to do that the public doesn't want to know about. And I always sort of read that that's how Section 31 was. So I thought for Malcolm, that he went into it with the idea that he was joining an organization that was patriotic and followed rules and was honorable. And then as he got involved in it, he saw that there was a little more dirt to it than he had thought, and that's why he left and to focus his energies in other directions. That's because I felt from his conversations with. That he had, when he was talking to Harris, that he was sort of like saying, like, I'm through with you guys, like that he left. Right. So not that he did his tour of duty and he went on, but that he left, and Harris is like, you never leave, right? And so I sort of felt like he came to some sort of a reckoning and saw the reality of what the organization, or at least elements of the organization, were capable of, and he couldn't stomach that. So I felt that was in character.
Nice, I like that. That works for me. And for listeners, go back and listen to our episode 179 of Warp 5. We had author David Mack on, and we talked about Section 31, and, it's a really great discussion. David Mack knows Section 31 inside and out, and we talk about the organization as they're portrayed in Enterprise and all over the Star Trek franchise, and, how fans have this general misconception of what they are, and they think that it's just like a CIA type thing, but how he goes into in depth as to how they're more than that, and how they are really truly evil. And it's really a great discussion, and so I highly recommend it if you haven't listened to it yet. That's episode 179, called Extra Legal and Morally Wrong. So
excellent,
awesome, excellent. Well, should we move on to Bound?
Yes, Bound.
So, Bound is the episode that I had actually been waiting for a long time, because I was always curious about the Orions. We'd only really seen 2 examples of Orions. You know, like I don't really consider that the TAS Orions are the same Orions. I think that it's something really different. I don't know about you, but it was really neat to see them come back. I like the episode. I think it's a lot of fun. There's some problematic elements in it, but I think the episode's a whole lot of fun. So what are your initial thoughts on Bound and seeing the Orions again?
Well, certainly if you're going to do a callback to the original Star Trek, then you'd want to go all the way back to the cage and by extension the menagerie, and they certainly do that in this episode, taking an alien race created by Gene Roddenberry, and exploring it, because they certainly are a race that you hear about the Orion Syndicate, and you hear about Orions throughout really all of Star Trek, but we don't know much about them at all. They're probably one of the least explored cultures, and I think part of that is because they're visual, right? And so both the men and the women are the men are hulkingly large, and they're green, and all that kind of stuff, and hulkingly green. You see what I did there? And I didn't realize that until I said it. And but I think that they never really got deep into the culture beyond the superficial things, because superficially that's all we were initially introduced to them as a superficial culture. So they tried to add a bit of dimension to them through the 3 female characters on the ship, and then of course the surprise reveal at the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'd seen them a little bit in the augment arc at the start of the season, right at that Orion trading market with I think the actor's name is Big Show, he calls himself, but we didn't really get much added to it. So that's almost like when they had the Tellarites in Bounty back in season 2, where they're just there. There's not really any exploration. It's just a quick callback to an alien species that we'd seen before. But yeah, you're right. In this one here, we do get a little bit more in-depth into who these Orions are. And, one of the things is they're always they're always been associated as these are the slave women because of what we saw in the cage as being this Orion dancer, and how they talked about Pike wanting to trade in animal women, right, if he ever did leave Starfleet. And so they did try and update that and modernize it, which is kind of problematic in itself, in that they're like, no, it's really the women who are in charge and the men who are the slaves, which, I don't know, to me it's just a throwaway line to try and make it okay, but it still doesn't work for me.
Yeah, I mean, if slavery is, if slavery is presented as okay for men, that's a problem, right? I mean, so it's not okay for anyone. So it's not okay if men are slaves. It's not okay if women are slaves. I mean, slavery is wrong, and I think the episode missed a chance maybe to make a comment about slavery, I thought, and as a social issue. It's there. And there is that element where Archer is trying to explain to the sort of the gift that he was given. I always thought that was kind of a strange thing that Archer would do, except that I guess he took it as a diplomatic, appealing to his diplomatic side, I suppose, and his concern for wanting to try to make alliances or something. But
well, my interpretation of him actually accepting the gift is just because the pheromones were overpowering him too much, and therefore they're more prone to suggestion.
Right. I was a little concerned about that, because he seemed stable at they make the argument that it's cumulative, right, in the episode, so that it becomes worse. So it's like the longer you're exposed to the pheromones, the more you're able to be controlled. So I mean, maybe he was spent more time with them than I had thought, but I always try to rationalize, like, why would he accept this idea anyway, unless his view was, well, we could free these 3 women. And that's where I thought they lost that ability to make a comment on, singularly worst, economic institution ever created, right? Slavery. And so make a comment on it, talk about it. And, they do talk about the idea that in Archer's world, people aren't owned and people are free, and they do sort of, when she's sitting there, it does seem maybe even genuine when she says, what do I do? What would I do? Right? I mean that. But then, of course, that even becomes because she's not really the slave, right? She's a manipulator, and the slaves are the men, and so it's not as an effective, I think, episode for what they could have talked about, and it would have been fine if they switched it and had the women being in control or whatever, and make you think you want to know the Orions, but you don't. But then really get into that culture, and what does that mean, right? I mean, so the men are slaves, but they're running. I mean, it appears like they run everything in all the other episodes. So are they just manipulated from behind the scenes? And why would they feel a need to present the men as the leaders, like to alien cultures? Because there are going to be alien cultures that have no men or women, and there are going to be alien cultures where women are the leaders. And do they adapt every culture? And since the Federation is an egalitarian society where men and women are equal, why wouldn't you just present the women? I mean, so it raises a whole host of problems that were in a way unnecessary, and I think misses an opportunity to really talk about what it means, because that's one of the things that Star Trek really hasn't dealt with much, really. If you think about it, is slavery as a human freedom, yes. Measure of a Man dealt with it in a very sort of esoteric, beautiful way. But what is property and that sort of thing. But that was almost like a philosophical. But to really truly deal with it in a powerful way, I think they could have done that in this episode and didn't do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the episode itself is problematic. It's fun to see the Orions, and it's fun to, get this callback to the original Star Trek. And you'd mentioned it earlier. I didn't want to interrupt at the time, but this is the episode where they do mention the Gorn, right, when he's giving him the drink. So we do get another verbal callback, which will be paid off in the next episode, or 2 episodes from now, in the Mirror Universe, right? But we get a little more payback on some more threads that are going through the show. But, I have to address it here, and I know I have to address it because I'm aware of the issue, but I'm not the best person to talk about it. And that we try and bring up as many of the social issues that we can that are addressed on this. And I know that in this day and age, people do talk a lot about how the pheromones only affect people in a heterosexual way, right? They talk about how the men are more attracted to the women, and the women are getting headaches, and it doesn't affect Trip because he's in love with T'Pol. It doesn't affect T'Pol because she's in love with Trip. But what does it do for LGBT people? And I don't have the answer to that. I know that other people have had this discussion, but I definitely wanted to make sure to mention it here because I am aware of it. My only headcanon is there's only 90-some people on the Enterprise NX-01. I'm guessing there's just no gay people on the show. I don't know. That's the only headcanon I can come up with.
I could be wrong. So somebody maybe, or I'll just go back and I'll look at it myself. I had thought there was a line in there that the women were affected, and it wasn't only that was. I remember the part about Hoshi having the headache and everything. That was definitely part of the story, but that there was a line in there. I could be wrong. I may be wrong, but I thought there was a line in there where there was the men and the women were being that there were, and some of the like Phlox has a line that says and some of the women. And I
can't remember off the top of my head.
Yeah, so. I think that they may have mentioned that. I could be wrong too. But yeah, that's I wonder if this episode would this episode get made today is also another issue, right? In terms of just its presentation of, to me it's an interesting episode because it's that classic sort of sea tale of the sirens, the mermaids, and they're calling the men, and the men are crashing the boat into the rocks, right? And it's very much that same kind of storyline where the men. But I mean, there's a lot of, the men are working out, to get their aggressions out, that kind of stuff. I mean, there's a lot of, if you wanted to take a feminist bent to the episode, there's a lot of things you could take and peel apart. I tend not to watch Star Trek from that lens, just because, to me, it's one of the lenses you would use, but I wouldn't put it in every episode. This one seems to be appropriate, I think, to use that lens. But I thought it was an interesting episode because visually, I thought it was, it seemed almost like a bottle show, in terms of the visuals of it. It was very claustrophobic the way that they filmed it. It was very much on the Enterprise. You got to see the Orion ship, and they kind of went to the planet. I mean, there were little tiny sequences where you were off the ship either by view screen or by Archer going and having his meeting on the Orion vessel, but it was kind of a bottle episode, and it felt like that to me. It felt like there really wasn't a lot of anything new within it, in terms of the visual dynamics of it. And it's a shame.
The Orion ship.
Yeah, we got that, which was kind of neat, and I think that the ship that they say they don't know what it is. I'm getting confused with the other episode. But I thought this is Marvin Rush's last episode where he was cinematographer, because he would go on and direct a few at the end. But it didn't give him a lot to do, I thought. There just wasn't visually as interesting. And Alan Croker directed it, who's, just a genius director, did 38 episodes of Star Trek, including the last episode of DS9, the last episode of Voyager, the last episode of Enterprise. He did the last of basically all of them except TNG. And even the direction in this, it seems sort of like I don't want to say a pedestrian episode, but just sort of like there wasn't anything that was very special about it standing out. But I did like the sort of siren theme of it. And I was hoping that they would deal with sort of slavery more as an issue. That, to me, that was more of an interesting issue than dealing with sort of the gender aspect of it, because the gender aspect of it was more of a MacGuffin, kind of like we need that in order to have the ship. The captain was a male, so the pheromones are, and he's a straight male, so it's going to be that relationship, and that. But I did wish that there were missed opportunities, and maybe there was also missed opportunity to say something about gender or sexuality, and they didn't do that either.
Yeah. So you had mentioned earlier in this episode, so we have Kelby. We've got this callback to Kelby, who's still agitated from the previous episode of having his command authority challenged by having Trip stick around, and that's continued and amplified in this episode. So these pheromones are making him more aggressive as well, and so we end up with this kind of conflict between him and Trip that comes to a head in this episode.
Yeah, and I thought that that was again nice sort of seed planting in those original episodes. But I thought in the episodes previous. But in a way, I kind of understood his position, right? I mean, he was promoted, and this guy left, and it seemed kind of like a willy-nilly, like I'm leaving, but I'm staying, and I'm leaving, I'm staying. And I know Trip is Trip, and he's great, and he's like the greatest engineer in Starfleet, but it seemed kind of like if I was Hernandez, I would have been mad, and if I was Archer, I would have been mad. It's like pick a ship and stick with it, because this kind of going back and forth within the matter of a very short period of time. To me, that doesn't ring very true, and seems more like you said, maybe a chance to have that one sequence and to give him a reason to have been on the Columbia.
Yeah, and we mentioned when we were doing our discussion on the 3-part Babel arc that it kind of comes out of nowhere, because his feelings towards T'Pol and his anger towards her, because in the first episode he's trapped on the ship with Reed on the Romulan hologram ship, and then all of a sudden, like in the second episode or whatever, he's like all of a sudden upset with her. I might have my episode numbers out of order on that, but all of a sudden he's just upset with her and decides to leave the ship. And it felt kind of forced in the arc.
They did. I mean, what I thought was good is they did do a good. I thought they had very good T'Pol character development in this episode. She has the really hilarious sequence at the beginning where she's talking about the flying reptiles and they breathe. Yeah. The report says they breathe fire, and so there's lingering questions about the accuracy of this report. She does brilliant acting and just really deadpan in the way she does it, and you get the idea that she's pulling one over on them, that she is sort of joking with them, and then at the end she jokes not once but twice with them, and that dimension, and then her willingness to be open a little bit with Trip at the end and wanting him to stay. I thought it was very nice, and that was a very sort of genuine, sweet moment within an otherwise kind of just sort of, I guess, fun episode.
Mm-hmm. Right on. Yeah, so now let's talk a little bit about the relationship with Trip and T'Pol, because we get a little bit more evolution of the relationship here. He decides to stay on the ship even though he decided to leave, even though the relationship had been causing him a little bit of trouble in the work environment. But we finally get this massive kiss between the two of them, in this episode. And I if I remember correctly, I think this is the first time. Right, we've had all these intimate moments up in season 3 and whatnot, but I think this is really the first time that, it built up, because in Home, we could tell that there was something building, but then she was going to get married, right? And then that marriage ended up in a divorce. But I think this is, if I remember correctly, I might be wrong, but this is the first time that they kiss. Am I right?
I think you're right. I think at least in an actual form. Right. I mean, there's a lot of sort of like gel sequences and stuff like that, prior. Yeah. But it's it's a nice moment because you get the idea that he stays, and again, great acting at the end. The look that she gives at the end is sort of like he's not telling the truth. Like he's like, oh, this is gonna, it is a big deal, and to him, it's a big deal, and so I thought that was a nice. I liked that kiss more than my wife and I are always cringe whenever we have these shows. I've just never seen it in reality where people are fighting and they hate each other, they're screaming, and then they kiss. Yeah, and it's like that's such a Hollywood bunch of malarkey, and unfortunately they do that in DS9. They have the kiss between Odo and Kira. Is that kind of like, well, why don't you just kiss me then? Okay. This seemed a more genuine kind of like she just goes up and it's like, I'm going to kiss you, and she kisses him. And they're not fighting, but they're having this, that tension is there, that but it's a soft tension. It's a and so I thought that was a more effective, thing. I always liked their relationship. I thought when they lose their child in the upcoming episode, or the child that's produced out of their DNA, is so beautiful and sad and horrible, and just one of Star Trek's most powerful moments, and as a parent, gut wrenching. And much like the episode of Voyager, where they follow that same line of reasoning with the doctor. But I liked the relationship between Trip and T'Pol, and I thought that was important for Star Trek to show that humans and Vulcans could have those types of relationships, because that kind of sets up the flip side of that, right, with Sarek and Amanda.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I mean, Trip, I've mentioned it before many places, that Trip and T'Pol is the one relationship that I quote-unquote ship, right, in Star Trek. I don't think Star Trek does relationships particularly well myself, but this is probably my favorite. This is definitely my favorite romantic relationship on the show, and I like how it builds up slowly over a lot of time to, we finally get the culmination in the finale of the real finale of the show.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Beyond that, I don't know that there's not much to say on Bound. It's kind of a one and done. So is there anything we missed that you want to talk about?
No, really. I see it as an episode of missed opportunities. Interesting premise. Great to see the Orions, but missed opportunity about slavery. Missed opportunity about getting more into the Orion culture and the complexities of it. And it it could have maybe been a two-parter, and then we could have learned more about the Orions and what their culture was really like, and those types of gender issues within their society as a reflection of our own. And they just didn't really. I think maybe the 41 minutes they needed to have the 10-minute dance scene. So that's being facetious, but that they obligatory nod to Susan Oliver, and that it just didn't. It wasn't. I mean, look, there's no such thing as bad Star Trek to me, because it's like pizza. There's some pizzas better than others, but there's no bad pizza. I've never had a bad slice of pizza in my life, and that's how I feel about Star Trek. Some are better than others, but none are bad. And this just isn't the best slice of pizza, I don't think.
No, this is just a plain old cheese pizza.
This is a microwave. This is the reheated microwaved pizza. It's still good though, excellent. But it's a little soggy.
Excellent, John. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. We're rapidly closing on our retrospective. We're going to finish it up before episode 200. So we've got one more. We got a wonderful guest tentatively to record for the last 5 episode recap. So hopefully that pans out. Should be recording next week. But that will be coming, and we promise to finish that up before episode 200. But John, why don't you tell the listeners where they can find you online? When you're not drinking wonderful booze from the Gorn hegemony. Best way is probably on Twitter. Just we're at Tenuto Family, and you can find us there. We have a little icon that's a Fansets Captain Kirk pin, so that's easy to recognize us on there. And our tweets disappear, but they do reappear. So we post them and then we kind of take them down. But that's a good place to get us. And people can also always reach me through just the internet. Do a search, and you can find my email at the college and give me an email. I love to talk to fellow fans. Excellent, right on. Well, discussing Season 4 is not all we've been doing here on the network this week, so take a quick listen to this clip to see what else you may have missed elsewhere on Trek FM.
Previously on Trek.fm, The Ready Room.
But Larry, how do you know that there's not a house somewhere out there on the Forge where Cybok's in the living room, Michael's in the living room, and there are like 6 other people in the living room that Amanda and Sarek and Spock never talk about?
They took us in for a while and they threw us in the house on the Forge.
The Edge, a Star Trek Discovery podcast.
Wait, so what switched between your 2 lists?
Calypso comes in, Runaway comes in second of importance.
Right. Okay.
But Calypso comes in second in enhancement of the season.
Okay. I see.
And really, even in importance, I could probably, in my head, flip Calypso and Runaway, because I don't need Runaway.
Standard Orbit.
Star Trek V, The Final Frontier, is the best named movie of the first 6 movies, I think. Because from a marketing point of view, from a Star Trek point of view, it's just a great title. You know, not talking about the execution of the film, I just mean it's a great title. The other movie titles were they weren't that creative.
Literary Treks.
So I think if you have an idea or a story for a Star Trek novel, you would be better served if that came on the heels of the 10 pieces of fan fiction that you've written or whatever, or things that you've written on your own that not necessarily fan fiction, but if you've practiced as a writer and have honed your craft, because they're going to want you to be a good writer.
Yeah, they're gonna, and that comes back to, they're gonna tie in editors, and this is not just Star Trek. This is anybody. They're gonna go with people who have demonstrated an ability to hit their marks clean, easy to work with, or at least able to work with, and can do that on a. It's like, okay, I did it once. No, okay, well now do it again. Now do it again. Now do it 3 times in a row. Now do it 5 times in this one calendar year.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
So check out these shows and join the conversation about your favorite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, please be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they are published. And please leave us a star rating and a written review. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, and most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link as well. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to do that. The best place to join in the larger conversation is the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, that's B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Choose to send to a show and select Warp 5. That will come right to us. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. Well, Patrick, you can find him every other week here on the network with another show called The Edge, which is devoted to Star Trek Discovery. And you can find me, you can find him on Twitter as well at MagicDrop5. But the best place to find him is in the Babel Conference. And for me, you can find me on Twitter at Brandon-Shea. I'm here on the network with our new show called The Line, which is all about Star Trek Picard. We've had a few episodes of that released so far. I'm over on the Fandom Podcast Network with a show called Good Evening, an Alfred Hitchcock podcast with my friends Chris and Tom, and we talk about Hitchcock films one at a time, chronologically. And last but not least, I'm over on the United Federation of Podcast Network with my friend Zach Moore from Standard Orbit. We have a show called Franchise Fatigue, which is all about movie franchises and sequels and remakes, and we go through them one at a time, and because we love remakes and sequels. If you'd like to help us keep all of our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month, and we really appreciate any support you can give us and hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/TrekFM. And at this time, we'd like to thank our wonderful associate producers of Warp 5, Norman C. Lau, Floyd Dorsey, Mike Morrison, Tim Cooper, Justin Ozer, Mark Flessa, Chris Tribuzio, and Jim McMahon. Thank you so much for your support of Warp 5 and Trek FM. Well, that's all we've got for you this week. Next week, we have got a movie night for you. We're only got 2 left, so we're also wrapping up that string of episodes before episode 200. So next time we have the movie night episode for Rosemary's Baby. Until then, remember, you can't be afraid of the wind.